Hi, I'm Joe Ferguson. Welcome back to Talking Vehicles with Joe. I'm doing a series of videos about cars that I've owned and some interesting things that have happened to them along the way. Some interesting, fun things that happened as I owned the cars, funny things that happened as I owned the cars, and giving you a little bit more of an impression of my experiences with the vehicles as we go along. Now, a car that I skipped over, I can't believe I did it. Maybe it's subconsciously because I want to forget it. But a car that I skipped over in talking about my vehicles was my 1980 Ford Thunderbird. I told you about owning it and told you that it had some problems, but I didn't really get into depth in some of the things that went on when I owned that car. That would be a whole video in itself. I'm not going to get into all the things that went on with the car. But just to refresh your memory, it was a 1980 Thunderbird. I bought it used in 1982, early 1982, and it had 42,000 miles on it, which was a lot of miles for a car that was only a year and a half or a couple years old. It was a not reliable car, is probably the best way to put that. It was white vinyl top, red interior, and it had a very upgraded amount of options on it. A very, very nice car, 302 automatic overdrive. I remember right after I bought the car, I drove it home and there was a squeak coming out of the front end. And it was when you ran over a bumper or the front of the vehicle pitched up and down because you were going over some uneven highway. Took it back to the dealer I bought it from, and they said, oh, it's just a bushing in the suspension, and they squirted some lubrication on it, which took care of the squeak until it rained. And that washed the lubrication off, and then next time I hit a bump, it squeaked again. And I went back to the dealer a couple times because of that. They kept putting lubrication on the bushing, basically kicking the can down the road. They didn't want to get into doing anything else with that. And then after the 30-day warranty was out, it was like, your problem now, which I wasn't real impressed with. But fortunately, it wasn't something that was created a safety issue with the car. The bigger issues I had with that car was not long after I bought it, and it was still under the 30-day warranty. The power steering pump and the steering rack failed on the car. By the way, this was a 1980 Thunderbird, the first year that the bird was affectionately or maybe unaffectionately known as the box bird. It was the downsized Thunderbird on the Fox platform and was extremely square. Gene Bourdonnais was the head of styling at Ford Motor Company at this point, and he liked things very square and very kind of boxy looking. And the previous generation Thunderbird was, relatively square car, had a little bit of architecture to it, but it was kind of square. But when they downsized the Thunderbird and tried to maintain those lines on the new downsized bird, it just didn't work very well. The proportions were wrong. The greenhouse looked way too tall for the car. Same thing with the Lincoln Mark VI. It just didn't work very well. But at the time, it was not considered to be ridiculous in styling. It wasn't very attractive though. It didn't sell very well like the old birds had. I owned this car. This Thunderbird had the EEC, electronic engine control system, that Ford had, and the ignition modules on those were known for failure. And my car experienced that, just like almost all other Fords that had that system did. The funny thing about it was, I told you when I owned this car, I was dating my future wife. We started dating, and our very first date, we went out in the car, and on the way back to the apartment she lived in, the ignition module failed intermittently the way it did. The car stalled, and we were on a very dark road. There was no real street lights on the road, and I kind of coasted to the side of the road. The car wouldn't restart. And she was convinced that I somehow orchestrated that. I somehow made that happen. And I assured her that I did. And we were close to her apartment. We wound up walking back to her apartment, spent a little time there. She put me in her car, drove me back up to mine. I got in and it started right up. And she was very skeptical about that. For some reason, she decided to keep dating me anyhow, and eventually we became married. That was almost 43 years ago now. So quite a funny story with that car. That car also needed, in the time that I owned it, the rear differential failed, and I had to put universal joints in it. The engine developed a severe low-end knocking noise when you first started it up. You could tell that the main bearings were getting sloppy. And I was faithful in changing the oil. Change the oil every 3,000 miles in that car. So I suspect that the odometer wasn't showing me the correct mileage on the car. I'm not implementing or indicating in any way, shape, or form that the dealer did anything untoward that he wasn't supposed to do. But somewhere along the line, I don't know if the mileage on that car that it was displaying on the odometer was true, or it just was a very, very unfortunate car. Poor materials, poor quality. The transmission had to be replaced. Like I said, power steering and rack and pinion. I also had a failure one time where I was driving the car. I just left my house where I was living, and I drove maybe a block, and the car just totally went dead, completely dead. Nothing. Turn the key, nothing. No radio, no auxiliary. I mean, it was dead. Popped the hood, checked the battery terminals. They were connected properly. Tried to jump the car, nothing. It wouldn't work. Nothing would get the car, power the car back up. Had it towed into the dealer, and a ground wire from the battery, or the battery cable to the ground, and the ground itself had gone bad, and so I had to have that repaired. I had a situation one time. A friend of mine actually was following me. We were driving on the highway that comes out of Pittsburgh, the main artery that comes out of Pittsburgh. And the rear taillights on that car were held in by a rope cock. There was a channel around the edge of the light fixture, and there was a rope cock in this channel, and you pressed the lens into the rope cock, and it would hold the lens in. Well, on my car, that rope cock had dried out, and the lens would just pop out. And I was driving down the highway, the lens flew out, and a friend behind me hit the lens and smashed it into a million pieces. Took it back to the dealer, and remember, this is in 1982. The lens itself was like $158 just for the lens, just to buy the lens. And, in today's dollars, that would probably be more like between $400 and $500. And then the labor to have them install it was another $50, $60. I wound up with over a $200 repair getting that lens fixed. And the lens was in two pieces. The taillights extended all the way across the back of the car. The lens was in two pieces. And sure enough, not a month after I did the lens, it was on the left side of the car, the right side lens fell out. Now, fortunately, it fell out while I was washing the car, so the lens didn't break. I was able to salvage the lens and took it back to the dealer, and they reinstalled the lens with a new rope cock. But by that point, I'd had so many problems with that car. It's just like, I got to get rid of this. And my wife and I were engaged at that point. My future wife and I were engaged at that point. And so we got another car. That's when we got our Pontiac Grand Prix that I had talked about in an earlier video. So I will now fast forward to another car that I owned that I really kind of skipped over was my 1974 Mercury Capri. Really liked that car a lot. I told you about owning it, but nothing really unique or unusual about that car. I enjoyed driving it. I had the 2.8 V6. I sold that car to my parents. My dad needed a car to get back and forth to work. He had a Mercury Capri prior to that one and really liked it. So I sold him that car, and he liked it and enjoyed and drove it for several years before he finally got rid of it. It rusted out. Fast forward now back up to where I had left off. I left off in the last video on my Chrysler LeBaron. We had leased the LeBaron, and One thing I did not mention was we went on right after we got the car. I mean, we literally picked the car up on a weekday. I believe it was like a Wednesday or a Thursday. We picked the car up. That Saturday, my wife and I left for a trip where ultimately we would wind up in Houston, Texas. We drove to St. Louis, went up in the Arch, drove to Tulsa, Oklahoma. We have a friend that lived there, visited with them. Then from Tulsa, drove to Dallas. A company that I sold for was headquartered in Dallas, and I spent some time there. Then we drove down to Houston, visited our friends in Houston, Texas for several days. I think we were there for maybe 3-4 days. Drove back up to Texarkana, then across to Memphis, went to Graceland and toured Graceland and saw some other sites in Memphis. Drove through Nashville, didn't really stop in Nashville, but drove by where the Grand Ole Opry was, and I saw a couple of other sites in Nashville. Then drove over to up through Kentucky, back up to Cincinnati, spent the night in Cincinnati, then drove back to Pittsburgh the next day. All in all, that trip was like 3,200 miles. And the thing that was funny about that was when I bought the car, the dealer told me, hey, we'll do your first oil change for free. When you get about 3,000 miles on it, bring it back and we'll do an oil change. And I'd had the car for like 2 weeks. So I go back into the dealer and I said, hey, I understand I get a free oil change. My first oil change is free. And the service advisor looked me up and said, oh, yeah. When you hit 3,000 miles, bring the car in and we'll do a free oil change. And I said, well, I want it now. And they said, you've had the car less than 2 weeks or about 2 weeks. Why do you want an oil change now? I said, because I got 3,200, 3,300 miles on the car. And they went and looked at the odometer and was like, wow, man, you're going to, burn through mileage on this car like crazy. So I got my free oil change. And that LeBaron was actually a very good car, but the lease ended and it was time to get another car. And so I went back to that Chrysler dealer. They had a Chrysler New Yorker, 1988 New Yorker, and that I talked about earlier owning. But a couple of interesting things that happened with that car was, number one, the day we bought the car, we go do all the paperwork and we go back out to get in the car to drive home, and the salesman is with us thanking us for our purchase. I sit down in the driver's seat and he closed the driver's door. Now, he didn't slam it. He just, closed it like he would normally close a car door. And the piece of fake wood trim that was across the top of the door, right underneath the belt line where the window meets the door, there was a piece of fake wood trim in almost like a fixture there. It fell out into my lap. Now, this New Yorker wasn't brand new. It was a 1988, and we bought it in 1989. Only had about 9,000 or 10,000 miles on it, but this wood fell off in my lap. And so I grabbed it, put the window down, and called the salesman back. I said, hey, come back. I need to talk to you for a moment. He came back, and I held the piece of wood out the window to him. I said, these aren't supposed to fall off, are they? And he was, terribly embarrassed. He apologized. He said, we'll get this fixed right away. So drove the car around to the body shop, and they re-glued the wood back on. And it stayed on for the rest of the time that I owned the car. But, my brain is going, oh, man, is this a bad sign? Is this... I almost didn't want to take the car, and I probably shouldn't have, because that New Yorker was not a good car. Some problems that I had with it, it began to, when it got about 40 to 50,000 miles on it, began to, in heavy traffic, when it was very, very warm outside, it began to have overheating problems. And I had it back to the dealer. They flushed the radiator, checked the flow on the radiator, checked the cooling fan. It was coming on properly, new thermostat. We just couldn't stop the car from overheating. And one of the other weird things that it did was, it had door locks that automatically locked. You put the car in gear, got up to about 10 miles an hour, and the door locks would automatically lock. Well, sometimes you'd be driving a car down the road and, at normal speed, 35 miles an hour if you're on a highway, 50 or 60, and the door locks would just randomly unlock and relock immediately. So you'd hear this thunk, thunk as the door locks opened and closed. And never could find out what was going on with that. I had various fuel system problems with the car, and it wasn't a good, reliable car. And that was when we decided we needed to get rid of it. and bought our 1993 Oldsmobile 88 Royale, which was a terrific car. When we bought that car, we picked it up on a Thursday and left for a vacation on Saturday. We left to go to Ocean City, Maryland. We had reservations down there. So literally loaded the car up. It had about 100 miles on it. Loaded the car up, and by this point I had a family, so we put the kids in the car and loaded the car all up with some beach stuff we bought, all of our clothes for a week, and headed down to Ocean City, Maryland. And I was marveling at that car. I filled the gas tank up in Pittsburgh, drove all the way from Pittsburgh to Ocean City, drove around Ocean City, and made it all the way back to Salisbury, Maryland before I had to put gas in the car. It was almost 500 miles. Matter of fact, I think I made 500 miles before I had to put gas in that car. It averaged well over 30 miles per gallon. And was a really, really good running engine, strong, never had any problems with it. It was one of the best cars that I ever owned in terms of reliability. The only thing I really had to do to that car in 90,000 miles was the water pump, which was very typical for those 3800s, began to leak, so I had to replace it. I did have to put plug wires on it at some point. The plug wires began to break down and not function properly, so I did that. I also had to put struts on it when it had about 70,000 miles. They had become very, very soft and weren't working very well. And one of them started leaking, so I just did them all the way around the car. And it did kind of like brakes. I remember I had to do like 2 or 3 brake jobs on it within 90,000 miles. And that was the one thing on the car that probably didn't hold up as well as the rest of the car did. But overall, that car was wonderful. I sold that car to a friend of mine. It was just about ready to hit 90,000 miles. It was like 89,990, and he bought the car. He lived in St. Louis, drove it back home to St. Louis, and called me raving about how much he liked it and how good it was. He drove that car till it had 250,000 miles on it and gave it away to a family he knew that was kind of in an economic hard time and needed a car. And they drove it till it had almost 350,000 miles on it. And by then the body was rusting and it needed to go to the junkyard, but it was still running. So we bought the 1998 Bonneville, and I only drove that for 2.5 years because my job changed and I had an opportunity to lease a car through my employer, which was my 2001 Toyota Avalon XLS. Great car. Enjoyed it very much. Was a good car while I owned it. I actually bought it out of the lease when the lease was done. And the reason I leased it was because doing it through my company, it was all inclusive. It included the insurance, it included maintenance. Basically, the only thing I had to do to that car was put gasoline in it and drive it and wash it. And it was a very nice car, very wonderful car. I remember how smooth and quiet it was. First time my brother got in the car and we went for a ride, he said, "Man, this is the best Buick I've ever been in." And, he was being a bit of a smart aleck. But it was true, man. I mean, this car was so smooth and quiet, just what you would expect. It was Lexus-like. It really was. And it was a very good car. So I'm going to stop at this point. We're starting to get a little bit long. I'll end the video right here. Next video series, I'm going to talk about the other Toyota Avalon that I had, a Ford Explorer that I owned, and I'll start talking about some of the Cadillacs that I owned. So thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. If you like this video, make sure you like it, share it, and subscribe if you haven't subscribed. And comment below. Tell me about some of the cars that you've owned that you have special memories of. I'd like to hear some of the stories. I think I'd really enjoy it. And again, thanks for watching, and watch every Friday for another Talking Vehicles with Joe.